In this trip to the Atari Archive, we'll be checking out the VCS rendition of the hottest game of 1972. As mentioned in the first episode of Atari Archive, when the VCS hardware was being conceived by Jay Miner and Joe DeCure, their mission was to build a console capable of playing, at minimum, home versions of Atari's Tank and Pong arcade games. Tank was the proof of concept game that would later be fleshed out into the pack-in title Combat by Larry Wagner, but even after hiring a group of programmers in 1976, by early 1977 nobody had taken up the task of writing a Pong game for the system. Of course, even by 1977 standards, Pong was an old game concept. The arcade version launched in 1972 is the first commercial game released by Atari. The company's founder, Nolan Bushnell, tasked early hire Al Alcorn with recreating a simplified version of the Magnavox Odyssey's tennis game, using arcade hardware as the test project. Alcorn's Pong project ended up being pretty fun, and Atari ended up releasing it and producing the first video arcade hit in the process. Less pleased were Magnavox or Ralph Baer, who in the 1960s led the team that created the Odyssey in the first place. Bushnell publicly claimed that he had never seen the Odyssey in action before in his life, a claim deflated when it came to light that he had signed into a trade show that showed off the 1972 game console. Eventually, Atari and Magnavox reached a settlement. Atari was able to continue to produce Pong and could make home consoles based off of Bayer's video signal technology as long as it paid royalties. Bayer later speculated that Pong's success may have led to increased Odyssey sales, as the system practically monopolized the home video game market for a few years. Atari was joined by a slew of other manufacturers in producing its own home version of Pong in 1975, and while the game was long in the tooth by 1977, it seemed like an obvious choice for a VCS project. After all, its console competitors, the Fairchild Channel F and the RCA Studio 2, had their own renditions of the game, and Atari had released several variants of Pong over the years in arcades too, adding paddles to create Super Pong and Ultra Pong. Added to all the other companies producing Pong clones at home and in arcades, the game still had a fair share of name recognition. Which brings us back to the VCS. DeCure said that Pong being included was a no-brainer, and he purposely made sure the hardware was built to accommodate the game during development. For example, the system is built to support 2 player sprites, 2 missile sprites, and, pretty much just for Pong, 1 ball sprite. Additionally, the VCS hardware and its TIA chip was specially built to read paddle controllers, used in the arcade Pong game and its standalone home version, by reading the electrical resistance each paddle's internal potentiometer produced in its current position. Each controller port could support 2 paddles, allowing for a maximum of 4 players. Finally, he made sure that the hardware included collision detection routines so that programmers, including whoever was to work on Pong, wouldn't have to cram that into software too. When no one else was working on the game by February 1977, DeCure picked up the project himself. Telling supervisor Bob Brown that he could think of a lot of variations of Pong, Brown agreed to let him constrain that to 50 variants, and DeCure got to work on what would be released as Video Olympics. He wasn't joking about the number of variations he could think of. He arranged 8 prime games, making sure that they had games that were horizontal, vertical, or a mix. Aside from standard Pong, he included Super Pong, adding a second paddle for each player, allowing for some trick shots in the middle of the playfield, Pong 4, a 4-player version of Super Pong, and Quadra Pong, a 4-player team version where each player had a goal on one side of the screen, teaming with another player against the other 2. Those relatively standard versions of Pong were just the beginning. DeCure also created variations on the theme based on other sports. By changing some graphics, he made Foos Pong, where each player had multiple paddles across the screen, and Hockey and Soccer, where the ball had to enter a specified goal area. Flipping the screen brought along Basketball, where the ball has to be dribbled and then bounced into a net, and Volleyball, where players bounce the ball over a net at each other. Using the button causes players to catch and hold the ball, throw the ball in basketball games, or leap up to spike it in volleyball. Finally, there was Handball, where each player bounces a ball off the wall and their opponent has to catch it. Nearly all of these have options for 4 players. The difficulty switches change the size of the paddles, and variations also include 2 uses for the button when hitting the ball to simulate hitting it harder. A whammy option, where the ball will careen off at a sharp angle for as long as the player holds the button, or a speed-up function that essentially kicks the ball up to its fastest speed, a lot quicker. This mix of variations is playable to varying degrees, though DeCure himself feels that Pong is basically unplayable given how much is happening so fast. The game also features a key difference from the arcade in how many angles the ball can be hit in. Arcade Pong only registers 3 directions, but a skilled player can knock the ball 5 ways on the VCS version, including a sharp angle at the edge of the paddle. Based on feedback from the arcade version, DeCure included a single-player version of Pong, dubbed Robot Pong, as the default game to give players a chance to practice. The arcade game could only be played with 2 people, and DeCure said players at the time really wanted a single-player version of the game to play in case they didn't have a partner. Atari never produced a one-player game, and it was left out of Atari's dedicated home Pong game. But with a processor, DeCure felt he could make a decent challenge. In Robot Pong, an AI controls the left paddle using a simple algorithm. To counter the fact that the computer could, in theory, play Pong perfectly, DeCure programmed it to follow the vertical placement of the ball, but imperfectly. The computer starts off aligning the top of the paddle with the ball, but every 8 frames will skip its alignment routine. Over time, this causes it to drift off enough to miss the ball and limiting its overall speed. It will also realign itself each time the ball bounces off a wall, creating strategies of hitting the ball at an angle that the AI will whiff or getting the ball moving so fast that it can't keep up. The AI routines are simple, are compact enough to have been squeezed into the cartridge, and work well for Pong. According to the book about the VCS called Racing the Beam, the developers of the 1999 Atari Arcade Hits collection ended up copying the Video Olympics AI for its own single-player Pong version. It wasn't alone as a game with an AI opponent in contemporary home action games, but in terms of providing a challenge without being insurmountable, it had little competition. Fellow VCS launch game Air Sea Battle's computer opponent constantly fired into the air due to a lack of room on the cartridge. Dogfighting game Spitfire on the Channel F did include a fairly impressive AI opponent. It also appears to have been released in 1977, but isn't quite as challenging to compete against and has been largely forgotten today. The Gunfighter game on the RCA Studio 2 included a simple computer opponent as well, but that title struggled against the platform's limitations and unsuitability for action games. After 3 months of programming and the time spent designing the hardware around what he needed for Pong, Video Olympics was completed. DeCure said he had included all the variations he wanted, though with more cartridge space he would have liked to include single-player options for all the games on the cart. DeCure believes that Atari being a game company first meant that their staff was focused more on making sure that the games played well more than its early competitors at Fairchild and RCA, and part of that was playtesting. After cramming the game into 2,048 bytes through clever usage of software interrupts, DeCure got the rest of the design team together to make sure the game was fun. This was in keeping with Nolan Bushnell's design philosophy, as he was insistent that the best games be easy to learn and difficult to master. Bushnell would tell the design team that they have to reward the first quarter, and they have to reward the 100th quarter. True to Bushnell's maxim, Video Olympics, and by extension Pong, is a surprisingly strong game in the VCS lineup. The game is trickier to get the hang of for a new player than one would expect from such a simple concept, and the smooth, high-speed volley between skilled opponents keeps it interesting. The game types with smaller goals and additional paddles can also feel easier for new players to ease into Pong, as not every whiff spells a lost point for them. While some of the variations are flatly better than others, they all feel like unique enough takes on the Pong concept that they're worth visiting. This was spelled out in relatively contemporary reporting. In Bill Kunkel's summer 1979 Arcade Alley column, he praised the Robot Pong, Volleyball, and Quadra-Pong variants, but was less enthused about Handball for its admittedly confusing blinking paddle setup for the inactive player, or Basketball for being outclassed for Atari's standalone release, which came out in 1978. Video Olympics, also sold under the title Pong Sports at Sears, was one of the earliest VCS games advertised. The VCS came packed in with a pair of paddle controllers. A simple purchase of another set turned the Video Olympics into one of the first party games. As probably the best game of the launch library to use the paddles, Video Olympics made a pretty strong case for their continued support. Indeed, unlike other specialty controllers for the VCS like the driving controller and the keypad, the paddle saw new game support into 1984 and remained packed in with the console until its 1986 budget re-release. And as one of the rare 4-player games on the VCS, Video Olympics pioneered a home multiplayer conceit that didn't seem to catch on in a mainstream way until 1996's Nintendo 64 console. DeCure didn't work on any additional VCS games past this point, but he didn't disappear from gaming. He went on to help design the Atari 8-bit computer line and the Amiga computer alongside J. Miner. As for Pong itself, it has continued to be reissued in Atari compilations, both as a simulated arcade game and as an emulation of the VCS version, even getting a PlayStation sequel in 1999. It's synonymous with Atari the company, console, and brand, and its inclusion on the VCS in a perfected form was the cherry on top of its 1970s arcade port lineup. Next time on the archive, we'll be visiting one of the best racing games on the platform, and it's only 1977.